A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flowered garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Celebrookins. Each episode we take a book, sometimes flowery, sometimes fruity, hopefully thorny, and we ask a writer, critic, or scholar to talk us through it. Today we are discussing Gene Wolfe's The Fifth Head of Cerberus, and I am delighted to introduce our guest, Premee Mohamed. Premee's fiction has won or been a finalist for an astonishing slew of honors, including the Aurora Award, the World Fantasy Award, the Ignite, the Nebulas, the Hugos, the Pushcart, the Le Guin, and more. She's done her time in the slush piles at the excellent audio magazine Escape Pod. She's one of those science fiction writers who is also a scientist, and she's one of those writers who constantly seem to have an exciting new book coming out. Premee, thank you so much, first off, for joining, and second off, for picking this book that was so much fun to come back to. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And thank you so much for the invite. I am looking forward to the chat.
We just started talking about the weather, and we didn't get as far in as I usually like to in my weather updates from people. So you're talking to us from Edmonton, right?
Yeah, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So for those of you who are trying to visualize where that is, we are around latitude 53. It's expected to snow a couple more times before we get into real spring, but today it's slightly above freezing. So we're all surviving.
This has been Weather Talk. What else have you been reading before we dive into this book? Anything interesting?
I've been doing a lot of nonfiction reading for some things that I am working on coming up. I'm rereading An Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is wonderful, very fungusy. I'm reading a lot about the Gestapo and World War II, which is, I would say, a lot less enjoyable. I'm rereading Moby Dick, as one often does. I just finished the wonderful Mercutio by Kate Heartfield, which, if that is not out, that should be out relatively soon. And yeah, I'm always reading several things at once.
I keep meaning to look up more about Mercutio because I keep seeing people I trust saying great things about it.
It is wonderful. I don't know how to put this because I am not a professional book critic or even an unprofessional book critic. But to me, it felt like a very grown-up book. Like, it feels very confident. It feels very assured. It's putting a lot of weight on the reader to figure things out. And it feels very trusting of the reader. And I really love that. Because I feel like I've started and not finished a lot of sort of recent-ish books that don't do that.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Okay. Well, that's definitely going on my list on top of everything else. I just finished reading Adrian Tchaikovsky's, probably not latest because he has books out all the time, but the latest in the Tyrant Philosopher books, the Pretenders to the Throne of God, which I really enjoyed that a ton. Something I've really come to enjoy about those, among other things, is I've realized how it's not that they're nonlinear. They don't have a central plot in a way they're kind of committing to. I feel like when a lot of people write like a kind of like a big multi-volume, multi-viewpoint fantasy kind of thing, you kind of get the feeling like, yeah, but there's a real plot here. And then we're kind of like bouncing around. This is like genuinely like 5 different things kind of like crossing at this point, which structurally I think is really interesting. But your talk about novels that trust the reader and don't explain everything to them is a great bridge to talk about today's selection. So today we're talking about The Fifth Head of Cerberus. This is Gene Wolfe's second novel. It was published by Scribner in 1972, and it's really 3 connected novellas. The first one, also called The Fifth Head of Cerberus, was published in Orbit 10, one of the Damon Knight anthologies. Interestingly, also came out 72, so came out, he got good feedback, and then just banged out 200 novellas in under 12 months. I don't want to think about it. It's an extremely twisty and tricksy book. It introduces us to the twin planets of St. Croix and St. Anne. They're now populated by human colonizers who may or may not have killed the previous inhabitants. Each separate section of the book gives us different viewpoints on the reality of the situation, often in ways that contradict or call into question what we've already been told. Very difficult novel to summarize, but we'll start with that. So Premee, this was your pick. Tell me about why you picked it, kind of what your relationship with this book, why this sprang to mind for you.
It didn't spring to mind instantly. It more came about because we were talking about books that are kind of a response to another book, like response poetry, which is one of my favorite things. People talking about what they would have done with the plums if they had not been eaten out of the icebox by you monster, etc., etc. Because my novella that came out in 2021, And What Can We Offer You Tonight, which was published by Neon Hemlock, was sort of a response to the first novella, The Fifth Head. And people have asked me about that, and almost everyone who has asked me to go into a little bit more detail has actually not read the book. I mean, the original book. They've read mine, and I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense unless you've read both of them. But what I wanted to respond to specifically was the deliberate choice that Wolfe makes in that first one to have the narrator character being brought up basically in a brothel. A very expensive, high-end brothel with highly modified sex workers, and you hardly ever hear from the women that are working at the house. I think there's one character who somewhat befriends our narrator, number 5, and she gets a couple of lines of dialogue, but otherwise they're kind of accessories. They're kind of ornamental. They are meant to be, and they are presented to be, and they move around the house like these decorative pieces, almost like vases on legs. And I guess my first thought was not just, oh, but this is such an interesting aesthetic, this sort of futuristic house of sin, and these very, very modified women in it, but also the fact that they don't play a part in the plot. They're voiceless. What if I took sort of the setting and swapped it around so that you hear more from the women than you do from the owners, this kind of mad scientist owner and his experimental children and their robot tutor, that kind of thing. So it's not really a piece of fiction or anything like that. It is not a retelling. It's barely a response. It's more just kind of playing in the same sandbox, I think, because I thought that some people in the story that didn't get a voice would have had a very interesting story to tell.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and it's reading The Fifth Head this time, something that so I hadn't read this in quite a while, and one of the things I'd kind of forgotten about it was it's, I guess I would call it like a surface level kind of like casual brutality. That I don't know how deep it kind of goes in the book, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to like concoct a forgiving model of the author, the narrator or something. But there's this way where this is a book that's so concerned with what's real and what identity is and what viewpoint is, that when you have these sex workers and these slaves who are so completely like, they're visible for a second, but then just kind of dismissed, that I can't help but wonder, like, whoa, but what are they thinking? What because they have agency too. What are they doing?
Well, and my perception with that always was, again, I always read Wolfe with kind of everything I've got turned up to 11, because he demands a lot from you as a reader. And in this case, in my reread, I find myself thinking, okay, but he's doing this for a reason. What's the reason? And the reason is partly world building, but partly to sort of up that level of uncertainty and to force us to ask ourselves, how trusting are we with a reliable or an unreliable narrator? And what are the reasons that we think the narrator is reliable or unreliable? Because as you say, there is so much very casual violence, dehumanization, misogyny, murder, brutality, disregard of agency and human rights in these stories. And I know that's meant to make us ask some big questions about the premise of the book, about the colonialism, about who's who, about identity. And in that sense, I think the book really, really works. And in another sense, I think it's a very difficult experiment. And part of me wonders if that would get published today.
Mm-hmm. There's Boy, bunch of thoughts off the cuff here. One just being like, it's interesting, I think, about Wolfe, this sort of like level of being really quickly and really obviously asking a lot of you as a reader. It's a little bit like a magician's act, where once you think, if you don't know you're watching a magician's act, it's just like a person doing some weird stuff with some cards. You know what I mean? Like, it's not impressive. But once you have in your mind, oh, there might be something interesting and magical going on here, it sort of like makes everything sort of charged with significance in this way that's hard to decode. But I want to come back to that idea. But yeah, you're right. The way that this is poking at issues of colonial powers and of dehumanizing, it's so interesting how it's framed. Again, I think it's that casualness that sells it and makes it so upsetting. Like having a viewpoint that starts, I mean, you know that the first one is being written sort of like by someone later in their life reflecting, but it's a child's perspective to begin. And to have a child narrator who just sees and accepts slavery is such just a jarring hit. Like there's no point where it crosses our young narrator's mind, like this is bad, right? Doesn't even cross it. This is like the society. And then when you see how people are treated, and again, just totally accepted, it makes it in a way so much more like impactful for me than a more kind of like, I don't want to say like dumbed down, but more like traditional, like someone would get up on a soapbox and explain why this is bad.
Yeah.
It's so much worse to just read someone who's in the system and believes it.
It's so much worse that there is zero soapboxing and that there is zero editorializing and that the reader is therefore asked, well, are you going to go along with this? Or are you going to be a little bit morally shocked? Like it's a little bit of a test. It's like the drop of blood they take to see how much iron you've got in your system before you can donate. You have to almost pause at those and say, what kind of person am I? And how can I tell that by how I'm reacting to this? When we talk about the child's love interest, even in the first one, the plastic surgery, the elocution lessons, the this, the that, the modifications, preparing this beautiful girl basically to be sold.
Mm-hmm.
And then the talk about their other friend, I don't remember her name, the blonde, who actually is sold by her parents. And the purchase of children, young girls, by the narrator's father, even that is not presented as a straight A causes B. This is why I would like to kill my father. Again, because Wolfe is not super interested in that. He's not interested in causality, I feel like. He is interested in raising questions that have multiple answers. And in that sense, I think this is why he's often held up as an example of literary science fiction, because genre is so often, we're talking about nuance. Genre is often presented as more binary. The question of the story is often more of a clear yes, no, rather than a how does or what is the reaction of,
I always get aggravated about like the literary versus non-literary modes of writing, because like their word means writing, but one of the things I think it often boils down to when people are trying to talk about specifically science fiction and fantasy versus quote unquote litfic is that in science fiction and fantasy, among other things happen. And in litfic, quote unquote, they don't, right? But I think that's really funny here because it's not just that there isn't a plot here, like stuff happens, but like not really. Like you're just kind of getting these little slices. Like there's this whole mystery of who is Five? Where did he come from? What's this line? What's his father really about? Are the Aboriginal people still around or not? We don't know. But these are all just kind of like little tiny slices from across these two worlds. They're not like building towards something. If anything, they're sort of like tearing down what we thought we'd figured out going into it.
Yeah, which I love. It's a very meander, spiral, explode type of story. You're moving the camera around, you're looking at different facets, but people have to remember, the facets distort things, the facets reflect things, they obscure things. You're not always looking at something through a clear pane of glass. What I especially love about the first one, The Fifth Head of Cerberus, which has sort of the most standard arc or the most linear plot, is that it reminded me of some books that start kind of with the climax first, or like the answer to the question first. Giovanni's Room was actually what came to mind by James Baldwin, where you may think going in that the question is, oh, what happens to Giovanni? That's answered on like page 2, and it's Giovanni is hanged. This is not a spoiler, probably. The book is like decades old. That's answered on page 2. So almost like, what do you do with the rest of the book? But that's actually not what the book is about. It's how did this happen? How did we get to this point? And why is it this particular narrator telling us the story? So we start with the fifth head, a narrator telling us specifically, I am writing this, shortly after I got out of jail. So the question becomes, why were you in jail? What did you do? So it seems like a fairly standard kind of yes-no question. Do we find out why the narrator was in jail? Yes or no? We do, but the real story is kind of everything that contributes to it. And then in the second story, which is just called A Story, it's really told more as a myth or a legend that does not come with what we expect from those, which is a value add, the moral at the end. We don't get a moral, we just get more questions raised. And then in the third story, everything that we knew, like you said, is kind of being brought A, together, but B, apart in terms of certainty. It's the improv of sci-fi, it's the yes and we're like, oh shoot, I thought that was going to be a yes but.
I really love that. Yeah, the first one, the fifth head, like the title novella, definitely works as a self-contained thing very, very well. But I love that the last one, the VRT, I think works really interestingly structurally, but it's also sort of like, there are books that tell you how to read them, and this is almost like a book that is telling you, like, no, you are misreading them. Like, because it's, when we have this officer who's going through this material, so it's this mediated way of approaching it, but we see him reading poorly and like skipping stuff, glancing over stuff, summarizing stuff in a way that's more about his political aspirations than like the truth of what he found. So it's this whole like, we have this idea of narrators as sort of stand-ins for writers who are like bringing us truth. And then this story at the end is like, no, like a lot of narrators are just kind of telling bullshit, that's why people talk a lot of times. And the way that so carefully pulls out sort of like the things you were standing on in the previous two stories is really interesting.
What's really interesting to me with that third story, VRT, is that it too changes genre. Compared to the first two, it's not strictly a sci-fi mystery anymore. It's not strictly a character analysis. It's not a myth and it's not a fable anymore. It's not a fairy tale. It's asking us the first question, which is this narrator reliable or unreliable? Then why would we consider the narrator reliable or unreliable? And the final question, which we should always be asking in cases with an unreliable narrator, is what clues or what truths are they giving us that they aren't aware that they are giving us? And so you almost have to pick out those clues like you're reading an old-timey detective story trying to figure out the murderer. But here it's, okay, so you mentioned this visual detail. So now I've got that in my head as something that connects back to something else that someone else said had meaning. And here you are presenting it in a different light. So which one of you is telling the truth? Well, I'm going to need more clues. It ends up reading, between the journal entries, between the interrogations, between the legal documents, it ends up reading kind of like a screen print where, one pass gives you one color, one pass gives you another color. And at the end, you're like, well, do I have a picture now? Or is Gene Wolfe just messing with us, which you are also allowed to do? But I like that there is no absolute assurance, even at the end of the book. I like that there's no certainty about identity or about memory or imitation or deservingness.
Yeah, there's no like, and then we ran his blood through a genetic detector and it turned out he was an alien all along. There's none of that. And I think part of why that works so well, besides just leaving it open, and besides having this like fundamental ambiguity, right? Like there's this like Rashomon level, like actually there are multiple coherent but contradictory explanations for what can happen here. And I think that's like, it's playing with, back to that like lit fic genre divide. This is a very SFF thing, right? That like part of why we read and how we read, like the conventions of the genre, are we're looking to piece together this coherent picture. And that's sort of the pleasure of it, right? Like you're reading a science fiction or fantasy book, you're like, oh, okay, I understand now how this new technology works or how this alien biology works. That's part of the pleasure of it. And here you get a few of those, and then like in the next chapter or sometimes in the same paragraph, you're like, wait a second, maybe it doesn't work that way. So without that instinct to kind of draw those lines and to like make that picture, it's not much fun to read. But with that instinct, it's like constantly being frustrated in this really interesting way. And you can't do that without that reading convention. I don't know. I love the way that it's playing off both of those.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think particularly for sci-fi, the capital we, I don't know. Particularly for sci-fi, I think myself and a lot of sci-fi readers are coming to it for kind of different reasons than people came to it sort of, I guess, in its original-ish versions. You know, the stuff that was being written in like the 1920s and the 1930s, like this steam-powered robot is hustling, rustling horses or whatever. And you're like, can you stop rustling horses? Because, it came out of like the Western tradition. Now I think a lot of us are reading because we are hungry for the kind of sociological and anthropological analysis that comes from somebody asking what would happen if a piece of technology or some other massive societal change happened in the future. What would be kind of the response or the consequences? And then we're very hungry to read about that. What does change? Does it change for everybody? Does it change for a certain class of people? Are women left behind? Are disabled people or the elderly left behind? Are you left behind if you're on Earth? Is this some amazing thing that you can only get if you are off-planet? Is off-planet just derangedly horrible? What would it be like if we blah, blah, blah? But here, you just get this world presented blump, kind of as it is, and there is no real digging into, on page, the consequences of what is presented to us very, very early on, Vale's hypothesis, which is what distinguishes these three little books from your bog standard, we colonized a planet and somebody was already there narrative, of which, of course, there are thousands at this point, or tens of thousands of books looking at that. This adds the extra twist of, well, we don't know. And you're like, what do you mean you don't know? You're a sci-fi writer. You're supposed to talk about what happened after this colonization and what it means for the colonists now on these two planets and blah, blah, blah. And Gene Wolfe is like, no, I just want to raise the possibility. And then I want to talk about some of the people entangled in these questions.
There's something I think really productive in the novel about how the colonial legacy is really, really haunting, but sort of at the level of the society, not at the level of the narrators per se. Because they're, in a way, like, they're sort of like, our first narrator is kind of like abstractly interested in Vale's hypothesis. And John V. Marsh, who is maybe the narrator of the second one, and at least partially the subject of the third one, is interested in it, but we don't really know what his deal is, like, in terms of history and his relationship to it. But this feeling that, we came to a new place and took all their stuff and maybe killed all of them. And then with this additional layer, right, that there's been a subsequent war and invasion, and you have this whole, like, French versus unidentified other power that has taken over, presumably North American-based, adds, like, this whole other layer of, like, a kind of like a subaltern in the background. Yeah, this haunting and this Vale's hypothesis, to me, one way that it resonates for me is as the phenomena of people inauthentically claiming Native American heritage as this kind of bizarre, like, I think somewhat consolatory, somewhat legitimating, right? Like there's this sort of acknowledgement that we have all these horrible things in our not terribly distant history. And that if we can somehow lay claim to the land in a way that draws on that sort of like excuses us. So you see that cropping up. But that's not exactly what's happening here. It's like even weirder. But it feels like part of that, right? Like if Vale's hypothesis were true, then we belong here. But if Vale's hypothesis is not true, then we're genocidal maniacs. And you're sort of one of those two has to be true. It feels like to the characters. I'm less sure that one of those two has, that it's like that binary. But Yeah, the way that it just kind of seeps into everything here is really interesting and strange and evocative.
Yeah. I think what I was thinking of too, especially in that third book, which of course is, the sort of Heart of Darkness, the Vor story or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is like similarly Canada's legacy and its ongoing oppression and mission to wipe out
Mm-hmm.
our Indigenous peoples, which has not really to a lot of extent stopped and is now going on under kind of a policy curtain rather
Mm.
than out and out the founder of the country, John A. Macdonald, saying he wished to remove the Indian from the man. And by the way, we can't do that, so let's just kill off, quote, all the Indians, unquote. The lack of awareness of that being a bad thing sort of hovers over the book. And then you get to that third story where you find yourself being like, wait a minute. Not only is it not binary, we may have like an extra set of players here.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they come from? Why are we just now hearing about these war? This war, who were these people? Why have we got the free people and the shadow children and the colonists and the humans? So it's another thing where people are not self-identifying as something. And I think that, to me, is the most interesting question of the book. And of course, of a lot of science fiction and fantasy is, who are we and what makes us what we are? If there is a life form that can imitate us that well, how much does it become us? All the questions raised over the decades in these different books. Well, this person looks like this person, but it isn't them. Okay, now we've covered twins.
Mm-hmm.
This person was produced from this person, but it isn't them. Okay, we've covered clones. We've covered alternate universes, other Spock with his evil little beard. We've covered doppelgangers, the evil you. We've covered people who change their appearance to look like other people. We've got what were they called in Dune? Was that the face dancers?
Oh, yeah, huh?
We acknowledge that that's not you either. But in this case, if they are talking about replacement, what does that mean? We don't know how it works. We're not given a mechanism. Sci-fi readers love a mechanism, even if it's wrong. We want to know how it happens. The face dancers, if I recall correctly, have a bunch of like tiny little bones or something instead of like a solid skull. And I'm like, that is disgusting. Carry on. I think in X-Men, there's some explanation for Mystique. The what is it, the Kree or whatever in the Marvel universe that can double people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that we've got trust issues, it's that we also trust that the narrative is going to tell us who is who eventually. The imposter will be revealed, and the real, quote unquote, person will be rescued, or they will be acknowledged in some way as the real person. And then you get into the fifth head of Cerberus, and you're like, I have a question, who's real? And Gene Wolfe is like, I'm not going to tell you because I want to ask it and not answer it. And I'm like, why would you do that to me?
And I feel like there's a lot of good doppelganger or shapeshifter fiction that kind of deals with the fact that if you look like someone long enough, to what extent you kind of become them. And that's part of the poignancy here. But the fact that the memory is gone here adds this whole other level to me of like, yeah, if you pretend to be something to fit in, to survive, you might forget what you were underneath that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is what has happened here, then there's this like sort of like horrific double tragedy, right? Where like the original people are still there, but they're also gone at the same time.
Yeah.
And the people who we're seeing in the present day are like world historical villains and not at the same time.
Yeah, they're both. Because if you are imitating a world historical villain, what does that make you? And then we also have to get into the questions of motivation. When people assimilate, as I tried to do, being born here, my parents are immigrants. And, again, it's a colonization story. It is an immigrant story. It's about people coming to a place and deciding which side of the line they are going to exist on. So honestly, my parents' philosophy for myself and my brother was, boy, you guys better do your damnedest to fit in. because you are going to have a laundry list of reasons for people to not accept you, to not hire you, to not promote you, to not date you, to not take you seriously, to not respect you. Get rid of as many of those reasons as you can. Be as white as you can, because you are living in a predominantly white, A, neighborhood, B, city, C, province. And the fields that you are going into are predominantly white. So blend in, blend in, blend in, blend in, assimilate. Then you do have to ask yourself later on, what have I lost? Unfortunately, by that point, if you have assimilated hard enough, you can't ask. And you can't really answer either. And I think that was what struck me as kind of one of the horror elements of the book, is that if you try hard enough to become one of the genocidal maniacs that has arrived in your planet, if you succeed, you lose the ability to ever do that again. That is horrifying, because you've flipped off the switch in yourself that left you the option of being able to do that because your assimilation job was too perfect. So yeah, I think I first read The Fifth Head of Cerberus in university. So there was a great used bookstore in Hub Mall, and that was really when my reading started to expand, because I didn't have a ton of money, and prior to that I didn't have a ton of access to books or bookstores except at the library. But at the bookseller in Hub Mall, a lot of their stuff literally was like $1 or $2. So I would have been 16 or 17, I think, when I first read Fifth Head, and I think I just imprinted on it like a duckling, because I wasn't sure which of the creatures, monsters, humans, aliens, blah, blah, whatever, which of those I identified with, because that's what we're looking to do when we're young and we read. You want to see yourself somewhere in the book, and even if it's a stretch, you stretch.
Yeah. I also shout out to the used bookstores that have maintained our literacy. I originally tracked this down because I became obsessed in my late teens with Michael Swanwick's novel Stations of the Tide, which is very heavily based on this. Like, he has said that like he physically describes the narrator as looking like Gene Wolfe, and it has like really obvious riffs from this novel in terms of like a shape-shifting indigenous race.
Oh, that's so cool.
I highly recommend it. It's more decipherable than this book.
Well, what isn't?
Right. but like this book, it's one of those books where you look at it and you're like, oh, I could build a college class around this. There's enough stuff going on in here that like you can grab it.
I love that feeling.
But also one of the odd things about that it sort of expanded a vibe from this book that I think I also pick up in What Can We Offer You, which is this like sort of like watery, slightly like New Orleans or Venetian or Amsterdamian kind of thing going on, which is never super foregrounded here. And I love that we're on these alien worlds and we get such little like straight, and here's what the alien world looks like. We get these sort of like odd creatures come on for a second, like they hunt like a tick deer, right? And like, what is it, a fane pheasant?
There's a tire tiger. I loved that too, because again, that is such a, I mean, we're not suggesting that even though this is Gene Wolfe's second book that he didn't know what he was doing. That is such a wonderfully deliberate, sharp thing to do. And that is, the reason that we have a brown bird with a red front here in North America called a robin that is in no way genetically related to the European robin. Ours is actually in the thrush family, Turdus migratorius, which I love the name. They are much, much bigger. They don't sound like them. They barely look like them. They have completely different habits, preferences, migration, everything. But, the British and the Europeans and everybody came over here and they were like, that's a robin now. So, on this other planet, they are not going to come up with a different word for something. They're like, well, that there thing that looks like a deer eats ticks. Let's call it a tick deer. Every layer of Gene Wolfe's screen print, even though there may not be a very large amount of ink on it, contributes to the picture. And that is exactly the kind of fiction I would like to try to write, maybe in a couple of decades. But that is exactly the effect that I love. And I think, I may have gone overboard with the description possibly in Offer, which again is very tricky because it's like a 21,000 word novella. But if we are writing from a first person POV or close third POV, what is going to be relayed is always, all you can see through that person's eyes. So there's no reason narratively to describe anything that that person is not seeing and noting, kind of.
Yeah.
So with that novella, the way I got around that, which again is very, very outre, the way I got around that was basically by suggesting that the narrator, Jewel, is so sheltered that when she's out in the city again, she notes the differences between that and her home, and she notes the differences between that and her childhood, and that's how the reader gets to experience it, not from these very casual glimpses of like number 5 glancing at the slave market and glancing back because there's nothing interesting there.
Before we move on, I just want to say that I love the Robin example so much, and I've never been able to get out of my head. There's a line in Pale Fire where Kinbote says, a robin, and then he like corrects himself, and he's like, well, a worm guzzling thrush.
Yeah.
But the bit with with the having a sheltered viewpoint, it's one of those things where the science fiction convention of reading and how familiar even fairly casual readers are with the idea of world building, and that we expect there to be these info dumps, and we expect it to explain that, like, it looks like this because it has a twin sister planet that's orbiting a common share, but like in real life, even if you are a highly educated person, rarely in your life do you like turn to someone and explain like, oh, and like, here's how we smelt copper, which we then use for these things. Like you don't explain all these fundamental things that are around you. You don't explain how like the tree of life works that happens to explain why this imported flower is blooming in your yard. And so of course you don't get that here either. Like
these are conversations that I have constantly when I teach writing, because regardless of whether it's a world building class or not, somebody will come in the questions and be like, either I don't know how to world build for my premise that I've got, or I've spent 3 years world building and I don't have a plot. And the answer to the second one is slightly easier, which is get on it or I'll hit you with a tennis racket. But the first one is think about your everyday life. You don't say, to your spouse, hey, honey, I'm going to get into my internal combustion engine car, which operates on the burning of gasoline and the allowance of oxygen in, which is fired by a spark plug. And, you just get in the car and you go. But the expectation of world building is there at the same time. So how do we find the happy medium between just kind of hucking the reader into the deep end of this vast world that we've built, or over-explaining everything and thereby writing an RPG manual instead of a novel? And the answer is exactly as Wolfe has done it, which is you explain the world where it touches the plot and you don't where it doesn't.
One of the things in the second section, which is just it's so weird than the rest of it.
It's so weird. Even the voice is so weird.
The voice is so weird. Part of me thinks it's a little too long. Like, is it sustaining this thing for so long? But then what it's doing throughout is giving us these bits of like, I don't know what to call it. They're like contradictory world building, right?
Yeah.
Where like, I think like when you start, you're like, okay, I get it. I'm getting a story of the indigenous people. And then you're like, wait a second, who's this other group of people? Who's this third group of people? Who's this possibly fourth group of people? I'm not sure.
The big question I think it raised for me on the reread, I think the big question that one raised for me is kind of the gotcha when you're at the like 2/3 mark, kind of, when they start talking about the star crossers and you're like, hold up. When is this set? Like, I thought this was exactly as you said, this is the
contact story or something. Yeah.
This is either the contact story or this is an old-timey, here is how the snake lost its legs story.
Right.
And I thought we were going to circle around to that. There might be some kind of starvation-related vision quest, something like that. And then they start talking about the star crossers, and I'm like, hold up, time out. Those are spaceships. When is this story set? I can't tell when the story is set. Neither the narrator nor the characters nor Gene Wolfe is very interested in telling you. So it's another case where you're sifting through the sand, trying to pick out these clues, and some of them are so small, and you're like, I need to read this with a notebook, which is why I love it.
And then when you come back to some of that information in the third one, and again, that idea of like the narrator who is not only unreliable, but like maybe just doesn't care, it again underscores that sort of like weird brutality in the society, right? And like the officer who's reading all this material of this fascinating, weird story he genuinely doesn't care, right?
Yeah.
And like when he like in the narrative that he's reading and listening to and watching, like when all of a sudden like the free people show up, I'm like, who are the free people?
Me too. I was like,
wait
a minute. I thought it was just going to be you guys and the Shadow Children.
Right.
Who are these free people? And they're like, hello. Even the descriptions don't help. I'm like, well, again, on a planet with people who can change their appearances. The other thing I think that really, really struck me too, which I loved, and I've used in some cases without really meaning to, was the constant descriptions, very similar, again, to sort of the colonists who came to Canada and encountered the indigenous peoples here, and were like, this is barely a paraphrase, but like, they are not human beings. They don't get human rights because only humans get human rights. They get the rights that we afford to either property or animals because they are animals that look like humans. And I think Wolfe actually uses that, possibly in VRT. And again, this just comes up so often in science fiction and fantasy. Sometimes people are using it carefully and deliberately, as here. Sometimes they're doing it kind of not on purpose, sort of like in combat games or wherever, where you can like kill a million of X orcs or whatever, I don't know, because they're not people. They are just humanoid shaped animals. And I used that in The Butcher of the Forest, where, there are, someone said, oh, there are people that live in the forest. Well, no, they're fae. So they are creatures that look like people. But of course, historically, that's been used to exclude real people from all sorts of things. And that's why in my upcoming novel, Wick Hills, this is a city that is not just composed of humans. At this point in time, it's about 3/4 human. That last quarter, though, all of those different species of vampires and ogres and centaurs and manticores and basilisks and things like that, those are also referred to as people. So it's when you say there are 3 people in a room, they may not all be human. And I was, the copy editor and I scuffled over that a little bit. Don't you mean to say monster? Don't you mean to say creature? Did you mean to say manticore here? Yes, my main character's boss is a manticore, but I am also saying there are 3 people in the room, not 2 people and a manticore. So this very, very deliberate othering, I feel like when we use it in narrative, it has to have a job, and it helps, I think, if the reader, or the realistically engaged reader, can tell that it has a job. So in these 3 books, how bad do these genocidal maniacs feel if they are eliminating something that they think of more as an ape versus as a different type of person? And that's kind of the question hanging in a cloud over the whole thing. How much does number 5's father think of the women in his house as human beings? How much does he think of the children that he purchases or sells as human beings, or that he modifies as human beings? How much does he think of his children as human beings and not just something that happens to look like a human being? These are really big questions for a small book.
I don't want to go down this road far, but one of my enraging responses to some of the AI discourse that's been going on is, are they possibly human or not? And don't need to go down that road for tons of reasons.
We do not.
But the thing that always, immediately springs to mind with any of that kind of discourse is like, well, have we extended human to all the people who are biologically human? And then have we extended personhood to things that clearly deserve some level of it? I think it's funny to me that in science fiction, we have we like, again, collective we, everyone who's ever written or read science fiction have struggled with like a good term for what we mean by like cross-species personhood. Yes. Right? I see people try to use sentient.
Yep. I've seen sentient, sapients.
Sapiens.
Two slightly different sides of the same coin, but the coin is not the currency we're really looking for here. It's something else. Yeah. We are asking, what is a mind that can have an experience and a realization about it, rather than what is a mind? And again, now we're getting into philosophical and biological and possibly even neurological questions. Right. Or we are pivoting into the woo-woo and saying, well, you're a person if you have a soul, and you're not if you don't. And the sci-fi people do not like that.
Right. Because we don't have any soul detectors handy.
We don't have any soul detectors. We have midichlorian detectors. We don't have soul detectors.
But yeah, the way that science fiction has both grappled with and extended that kind of colonial, like, great chain of being kind of thing, that, like, there's a line below which it's fine to do whatever, and
Yeah.
above which rules apply. That was fascinating. And this doesn't offer any solutions, but I think
No.
having these viewpoint characters who are these sort of, like, they kill slaves for, like, no reason. We have, in the last section, we had this really just very casually brutal sort of relationship with a sex worker and the slave of the office, right? Just sort of, like, revealing this level of disrespect. And I think that unease that it calls up in us maybe works better than having someone explain why it's wrong and we need to have a revolution fictionally,
Yeah. I think too, again, reading this now as opposed to reading it in like 1998, when I think roughly I first read it, now at least I get to think about things like Star Wars, Is killing the droid army worse or better than killing the clone army? Those clones wouldn't exist if they hadn't been constructed to exist. So what's the difference between the two made things? The difference is, like the Bad Batch episodes. They are trying to distinguish the clones as people, as individuals. But then again, a lot of viewers are watching these cartoons, basically, meant for kids, to be like, well, just a damn second. Why are these droids different from the droids that we love? Like R2-D2, who can't even talk, by the way, or C-3PO. Well, they just are different because they're disposable, they're expendable. Okay, well, clones are clones are not disposable or expendable. Clones are people. Okay, so
Yeah.
there's just the questions unfold and they keep unfolding. It's like one of those origami things that's about yay big, but was made from a piece of paper that was like 13 feet wide, which again is one of the things I think that specifically science fiction is so good at when it's done well, that it just raises the questions, which raise more questions, which raise more questions. And hopefully that gets people to imagine different answers, different possibilities. Ideally, someday, a different future that we've had a hand in nudging, if not making, sort of as opposed to works where it's looking more consistently, or for more of the text, inwards rather than outwards.
There's something there about how what really needs to happen to change is not that, science fiction gives us an answer, but that the background culture that produces this has shifted enough that instead of the question being, who do we extend it to in our great knowledge, right? But that, like, it's more of an assumed background. There's a bit in another person I don't want to go down the road about. There's a bit in one of the Scott Card early, I think it's maybe in Xenocide, where they talk about, like, there's actually like a or Children of the Mind, one of those early ones, Speaker for the Dead, where they actually lay out like a ranked schema of how, like, other minds might work. And so there's people who are just like us. There's people who are, like, a little different, but we can recognize they're people. And then there's people who might be like us, but we can't tell because we can't communicate in the same way. And we have to exterminate those, is kind of like the framing of it. And, like, later, like, in his defense, like, he does sort of like embroider that and say, like, actually the test is not in telling which category they are, but who you can sort of, like, extend it to and sort of extend grace to, even if you can't tell. But so much of science fiction is based on that.
It makes me think of the first time that I read the Lilith's Brood books by Octavia E. Butler, which just blew my mind because I think up until then I had been getting quite used to, here's a sci-fi book with aliens, but the aliens are, come on, they're more or less human. They act in a human way. They have a very, oddly enough, sort of North American male cis white human culture.
It's funny how that showed up on so many star systems.
Funny how that showed up. Wow, like all over the world. Once we got the translator working, it turned out that they talked a lot like a white guy in his mid-60s from Midwestern America, which is very odd, but it is. But then, you get into that first book. Which one was the first book? Was it Dawn? And I was just rocked back on my feet with this blast wave of, oh, these are really aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And they also regard us as really alien aliens. And all of their adaptations have nothing to do with accommodating humans or humanity or any sort of Terran ecosystem or anything like that. And I just loved it, particularly because the book's focus is, oh shoot, we are talking about who to extend the language, the term humanity to. And they are talking about what to do with us in terms of extending rights to us, in terms of extending anything to us, including the right to keep living, including the right to agency and reproductive self-determination and everything. And I just loved the way that Butler, again, grabbed the camera and shoved it so that it's pointing back, in a different direction. And it's not just humans dominating, blah, 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 humans colonizing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm so glad that I read that book when I did. I wish I had read it earlier, but it rearranged, I think, everything about how, if I ever did write about alien species, I would like to write about that in the future, because, it keeps coming up that what we want to do is be presented with people who are more or less like ourselves, even though we know that's the least likely thing to happen.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, a refrain of this show is I keep coming back. There's a bit in Tolkien on fairy stories where he talks about like one of the real desires at the heart of this kind of storytelling is we want to meet other kinds of living things and sort of talk to them. We want to find the talking fox. We want to find the talking dragon. We want to talk to him.
We do. We want it. Yeah.
We've been going really good. Let's take a really quick break. I'm going to grab a drink of water, and let's come right back and talk some more.
Yeah, I think I just keep coming back in these stories to the question of who gets to be a human.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's such a universal question in sci-fi and fantasy, and it extends to so many different categories of who gets to be a human and who gets to be me. If I'm possessed, am I the same person? If I am cloned, is that the same person? It's just, it goes on. And how do you lose status as a human being? Because you can, especially, again, in genre, you can start off as a human and end up as something else.
Right.
What are the ways that people have been doing that in fiction? And what are we hoping to accomplish narratively with an ending that does not restore their status? Kind of.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, like Wolfe is not interested in spoon feeding us the answer.
Mm-hmm. But so much of the emotional power comes from it.
Yes.
I was thinking, this doesn't remind me of Philip K. Dick in a lot of ways, but in that specific way, I think about that a lot. Just that ambiguity.
Yeah.
Like, are the replicants humans or not?
Yeah.
Them trying to answer that for themselves is what like gets me.
Yeah, me too. I was thinking about that too. Like, again, it is the Blade Runner question. Is the question of whether they are people more or less relevant than the question of they want to live? Is that bad? And should we stop them either from living or from wanting it? So the questions that are raised there are kind of the same as in The Fifth Head is, who gets to be a person and how do you hang on to that? And how do we tell? At least in Blade Runner, they've got a way to tell.
Right, yeah, in theory, yeah.
In theory.
They've got a soul detector. It's funny here, too, that, like, of the many, like, intentionally frustrating things this does, qua science fiction, is not telling us about the war, not telling us about, like, in the third one, they mentioned, like, oh, yeah, there's a junta in power. I'm like, oh, okay, that seems like a big deal.
That seems like a big deal. Like, all these people that were, like, maimed or killed or burnt by the war, and I was like, wait, what war? What war? Can I have more details about the war?
And the shift to, it's when it's not depressing, it's comic. The sort of like Orwellian, Kafkaesque interviews they're doing at the end, where they're just like turning on a dime, and it's this surreal. You don't really know why they're really asking questions.
Yeah.
you don't know if the person they're interrogating is being honest or not, and you're not sure that it adds up to anything or even could.
Yeah. Well, it's the big question of when people are being interrogated in situations like these, whether or not they are in the fifth head of Cerberus, what little power they have is in the answering of questions and the manipulation of the interrogator. But again, it's just a demonstration of how little that power is and how much the manipulation can work or what it will get you. I think I talk about that in The Siege of Burning Grass as well, is your answers don't make a difference if your interrogator already has a set of answers in mind that they are hearing anyway. So, when you're listening to the tapes, you're like, okay, well, at least this way we get to hear what's being said. When we read the interpretation, you're like, oh, the screen has slipped. Something isn't printing right here.
And that, I don't know, there's something just, on addition to all these levels of like sort of like human rights issues and cruelties and individual hurts and crimes that have happened here. There's this like deeper level for me of just like meaning has been sort of like expelled from this system in a really deep way, that the people in charge of records and keeping track and applying justice at like a deep systemic level don't care and can't find it out. It's so weird to me, especially because again, we're so invested in like, is the person they're interrogating a shapeshifter or not?
Yeah.
I want to know.
Well, I think what kind of the last for me part of the puzzle there was not just that very, very common colonial, oh, well, we don't need records for this. We own this now. So it's fine. We can just, file everything away. That mention in the first novella about, this place has only been in existence for less than 200 years. And I was like, that seems useful to know. So this is a very new colonial experiment, but it again raises the question of we don't know what we don't know. And it should, but like, we also don't get to find out what we don't know.
Right. And again, that goes back to these like these weird layers of cultural like legitimating where Marsh asks, why does everything look so old here? I thought you guys were here. Like they've specifically built something to look like they've been there a long time, even though they haven't been. There's one thing I have to throw in here. I keep forgetting to get to it. Is do you happen to know by chance Hilary Putnam's Twin Earth thought experiment?
No.
This is just. So it came out in like, I want to say like 73, 75. So this is a philosophy thing about semantics where, so imagine that there's a identical version of Earth somewhere else in the galaxy, like identical, down to the continents, down to the languages they speak, everything. But somehow the liquid that's on that planet isn't H2O. It's not water in our way. It acts the same. And if you didn't have like, I don't know, if you have pre-nuclear science, you can't tell the difference, right? If someone on our planet and their identical doppelganger on the twin Earth say, I'd like a glass of water, are they referring to the same thing or not?
I don't know.
And so what Putnam is trying to argue is that meaning is not totally within your head, right? That, like there is an external component to it that matters in some way. And that is one of those levels here that is so interesting and frustrating because we not only do we not get what the individuals know, we have no way to access what's really going on here. I think that's part of what Wolfe is poking at. It's like, why do we readers who do this world building, because it's the readers who world build as much, right, as the writer, why are we so fixated on having this final answer?
Yeah. I think a lot of that too kind of goes to the, as you were just saying, kind of the external component of language is that we all have to agree on what something means. So we are sitting here like, okay, well, we're reading a book. It's in English. We should be perceiving that the words in English mean what we agree them to mean. The fact that we are reading about alien words, alien worlds and words actually, though, kind of adds that on there. Like, what do they mean when they say people? What do they mean when they say animal? I'm starting to get the sense that we are not all in agreement on what those words mean. So that sense kind of builds up and builds up. And by the time you get to the end of the third book, you're like, I don't think I know what English is anymore, actually. Which again, quite an accomplishment for somebody who was actually an engineer.
And that's again, that sort of like that weird quasi-tragic level of just people talking past each other,
Yeah.
not really speaking to each other, not really seeing each other, not able to see each other. Yeah. We haven't even talked about much of like the actual language of this book or the style of this book or
The three styles of the book.
the three styles of the book. The way that like even though it's doing all this obviously very like cerebral, twisty, puzzly stuff, it's also got like really belabored dad jokes and like weird like dirty puns that he's
Yeah.
trying to pull off in here. We've been going on this really good. We could talk about this all
We
day.
could talk about this all
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
I dug up one of my copies.
Ooh,
even.
nice. Ooh, is that the one with
Yeah.
Mr. Million on the cover?
Yes.
Nice.
It annoys me that I could not find the other one, which actually has the statue on the cover. But that is a much smaller book, and it turns out that if you lose a small flat rectangular thing in a house full of thousands and thousands of small flat rectangular things, you may never find it.
Uh-huh. I had to go get the Tor reissue, which I am very glad is available. Although
Ooh.
I will admit to having occasionally mocked its cover because I think the others are so much more fun. This also has a really great, I will say though, it has a great short introduction by Brian Evanson that's really nice. Evanson has this line that I want to think about a ton where he says, "This isn't a novel, it's a simulation of a novel."
Ah.
Because like if it were a novel, it would build towards something, and this is actually like keeps knocking out like the ladder from underneath it as it goes. I
Yeah.
think that's fun.
Yeah, I like that.
This has been good. We could keep talking, but we got to go. Before we get going, Premee, tell us if you have anything you want to share, perhaps a book coming out people could pre-order, perhaps where people can find what you're up to online.
Perhaps. Yeah, I would love if people signed up to my Patreon, which I'm planning on working on more this year. I say that a lot. It's just patreon.com/Premee, Premee. My website is still under development, but premeemohamed.com. I'm on Blue Sky quite a bit with the same handle. If people want to hang out socially. And I have 2 books coming out this year. So the first is Wick Hills, which will be coming out from Tor in early September, and is the story of a government agent in one of the only 6 cities left in the world who is unexpectedly assigned to protect a scientific defector from another city, which is an extremely new thing because generally people don't defect in a world where you can't move around very much. And of course, everything goes wrong. So it's kind of a magical city spy thriller, Cold War, but really not book.
Cool.
I'm not really selling it.
No, that's good. I think a fantasy / science-based Cold War thriller book. That's like we're ripe for a shelf for that. So good. Yeah.
I hope so. And the second book is actually a tie-in novel with the Magnus Archives universe, their first ever. It's called The Library of Jürgen Leitner, and is co-written with Jonathan Sims, who is the creator. So everything should be canon. Fingers crossed, because Johnny would have flagged it if not. And that will be coming out in October. And both of those books are available for pre-order now. And I'm also teaching for the Carl Brandon Society. I will be doing modern cosmic horror. And we could have probably had a whole nother episode about which of Gene Wolfe's books are explicitly cosmic horror and which ones are implicitly cosmic horror. Because I have thoughts, but unfortunately, we are talking about a different one today.
Premee, thank you so much for joining, and yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments, drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. If you are reading ahead, got a big one coming up next time. Dan Hartland is coming back to talk about John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar. In theory, I've got some convention and conference episodes coming up, including the Science Fiction Research Association, ReaderCon, and WorldCon, but we'll see how those go. Check the website if you want to read ahead. We've got some great guests and books lined up. As always, thanks for listening, and stay critical out there.